everyone, and welcome to my live stream. Today I'm joined by the ever so wonderful leader of AdvanceUK, Ben Habib. Ben, thank you for joining me. I won't waste time too much as there's so many questions that I've got to get through. But first of all, congratulations on your launch at the weekend. How did it go?
Oh, thank you, Sophie. Good to see you, and thank you for having me on. It went, absolutely brilliantly. We had some headwinds, as you might be aware, Sophie. We had booked a hotel, which then cancelled us at the last minute when they discovered who we were, even though we had warned them that we're a political party and so on. But I think they'd received sort of threatening telephone calls and I think they may have even had people turning up to their hotel threatening them. Anyway, the manager panicked, cancelled us at the last minute. So we had to get a new venue. Just about everything in Newcastle, which is where we launched, first said they were available. And then when they found out that we're Advance UK, they declined. But there was one brave proprietor of a restaurant that allowed us in. And we had 460 people, I think, in an area which was really only set up for about 150 or a couple of hundred. So it was all crammed in. And in fact, it made for a kind of electric atmosphere because no one knew to the last minute we were going to be on. And then it was on. And then we were all together like a family. And so I think it worked extremely well.
Yeah, I saw you speak in the run up to the launch a lot about the local council causing problems in
Yeah.
Newcastle. Obviously, we have local elections this year coming up. What is Advance UK's plans for those local elections? Are you going to run in them? Have you picked your candidates? How are you going to pick your candidates? I know that you've spoken a lot about reform and their sort of internal and the way that they pick their candidates and internal democracy. How is Advance going to pick your candidates? How are your candidates for local elections going to be selected? And what are your flagship local election policies going to be?
Okay, so we're not focusing on the local elections, not at this stage in any event. Our eyes are completely on 2029. We've got 4 years to get a party together, get policies in place. We want to get to the stage where we've actually got draft legislation in place so that people can see precisely what it is that Advance UK would do if it won office, not airy-fairy promises or sort of politically expedient declarations which get reversed the minute you get into office. We will have the legislation there attached to our manifesto so the British people can actually see precisely what we're going to do. And there's another reason, by the way, we're going to do that. It's because it prohibits the Lords, and it also prohibits the Lords from interfering because that is an election manifesto. The draft legislation will be the election manifesto. So the Lords won't be able to interfere and even change. They won't be able to change a bit of the draft legislation. We'll be able to push it right through. And that obviously also brings pressure on the civil service. They'll be under pressure to accept the draft legislation as it is and implement it once it becomes an act because it's got a democratic mandate. And I think that's critical. Sophie, we've seen government after government actually promise things that they then haven't delivered. And they've got into real trouble, I think, both with the people, but also the civil service and so on, who can then run circles around them. Boris Johnson, for example, got into office on ticket to get Brexit done. And as we all know, for anyone who really examines what he didn't get it done. And he promised to bring immigration down, and immigration went through the roof. So we're going to have it all there, ready to go on day one. And we're already beginning to draft our policies, and then we'll draft the legislation that goes behind it after that. But a critical component, as you rightly touched on in your question, of succeeding as a government is not just having the policies and the legislation, but having the people that can deliver it. And the other thing that Advance UK wishes to do is not to recycle the same old tired politicians who got us to this failed position in the first place. And I've been inundated and bowled over by the number of really clear thinking, patriotic people who haven't been in politics before, but now do want to get involved from different parts of, the economic landscape, as well as the institutional and public sector landscape, from all walks of life. And, that's the kind of parliament we want. Really capable, brilliant thinkers, capable people, fearless speakers who can go into Parliament armed with an agenda, armed with this draft legislation, and then absolutely deliver for the British people. So our focus is on getting the best policies, all drafted up into legislation, and getting the best people ready for 2029. All eyes on the general election. But there's no doubt that en route to the general election, we will have councillors who join us, councillors or people who wish to stand in local councils, and then we won't stand in their way. Obviously, we will support those members who wish to stand in local council elections, and where we see a particular opportunity, we may also make a determined effort. But that would be more opportunistic, if you like. So if we were going to, strategically, we're focusing on 2029.
Yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, I've run campaigns before for MPs, but I've got to say it's very hard to get an MP elected if you don't have any sort of scope or knowledge in local councils, because a lot of your activists actually do form local councillors. What about your sort of constitution then of reform? I touched on how you're going to select your candidates. Have you started working on the democratic processes inside Advance UK? Do you know how these MPs are going to be selected? Is it going to be done by their branches? Is it going to be done by you? Have you got any sort of progress on that so far?
So the first thing I did before launching the party, even before disclosing that we were going to launch a party, was to draft a constitution for the party, which actually mirrors the British constitution. Fun enough, we have a number of bodies of people within the party. The biggest body, and obviously the people from whom we take our mandate within the party, are the members of the party, and anyone in the United Kingdom that's a British citizen and is on the electoral roll and not a member of another party can join Advance. We're not going to be policing our members' views. And, for example, Tommy Robinson is a member and he wasn't welcome in Reform, but all British citizens are welcome to join Advance UK. They constitute the democratic check on the leadership. And by a simple majority, the membership can remove any director of the party, including the leader, and they can call a plebiscite, a vote, anytime they want. Then, above the membership, if you like, derived from the membership, is a body of people called the college. And the college will comprise between 50 and 100 people, and they will come up periodically for election by the membership as well. But the purpose of the college is to act as the intellectual ballast as well as the eyes and ears of the membership, keeping the leadership, that's me and the executive, under control, making sure we don't deviate from our mission statement, which is also set out in our constitution. And then, of course, you have the leadership, which is me and all the executives I appoint, including prospective members of parliament, prospective councillors if we stand in council elections, all the paid up members of our campaigning teams. They will all come under my remit, as it were. And then you have. Sorry, can you hear me? Then we have a board of directors, which comprises members of the college and the leadership. So the college, if you like, is like parliament. The executive in the party is like the government, and the college holds the government to account on a day-to-day basis, and the members can change members of the college over a period of time. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So that's pretty cool. Obviously, you said you're not focused on local elections this year, but what about the mayoral elections? As mayors have quite significant new powers, and obviously we've got a lot of new combined authorities coming, and some could argue that the mayors, in fact, have a lot more power in terms of to impact people's lives than a backbench MP. Have you got no ambition to stand in the mayoral elections in the upcoming years?
So again, we'll play it by ear. As a matter of principle, I'm against all the different layers of government that have been created over the years. There's been bureaucracy laid on bureaucracy, and that's a recipe for spending money and not getting things done. And whilst I think it's vital that we have local representatives running their local areas, that's a system that has worked extremely well for the United Kingdom for a long, long time. I'm unconvinced about the devolved authorities and the mayoralties. And in government, it's not going to be our priority this side of the general election. But once we get into government, we will be looking at the mayoralties and devolved authorities and how they all work and whether they work or not. actually. One thing I'm moving on slightly, but one thing that I find really hard to come to terms with is this notion that the United Kingdom is stronger by having four devolved authorities splitting effectively the United Kingdom apart from a governance perspective, and particularly in Northern Ireland and in Scotland, giving people a soapbox, people who are anti the United Kingdom, giving them a soapbox. I can't see how that helps the country.
So how would you deal with that if you're in government? Would you roll back devolution?
Well, we're going to be looking at it with a very critical eye. And if we are able to roll it back, that would be the aim. We've got to do it carefully because we don't want people to feel disenfranchised. We don't want them to think that Westminster's taking a top-heavy approach to the governance of Scotland or Northern Ireland or other places. But we also want to bring the union together. We are the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, including Wales and Scotland, obviously, in Great Britain. And I think we need to find a mechanism by which all the various people in this country have a voice, but that voice isn't used to break up the UK.
So you're really passionate about Northern Ireland, perhaps more so than many other politicians in the UK. But we've never really seen a British party do very well in Northern Ireland. Labour don't stand. Obviously, their sister party in Ireland does. The Lib Dems don't stand. The Conservatives have absolutely zero support in Northern Ireland. Do you think Advance could be a successful British political party in terms of in the mainland Britain and in Northern Ireland? Because we haven't really seen that before. And if so, how are you going to do it?
So it's interesting, Sophie, the governance, if you like, of the political process in Northern Ireland is separated from Great Britain. If you want to be a political party in Northern Ireland, there's a separate application process you have to go through. There's Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And again, that's something I think that needs to be reviewed. The other thing that's interesting about Northern Ireland is that foreign donations are not prohibited for political parties in Northern Ireland. They are in Great Britain, but not in Northern Ireland. And that is a nod to the Republic of Ireland by the British authorities, because they're allowing effectively money from the Republic to go into politics in Northern Ireland. And that's very wrong. So we're going to be looking at the rules by which politics in Northern Ireland take place. I think we should be looking at pan-UK political regulation, and it should be very easy for a party in Great Britain to stand in Northern Ireland. And we absolutely have Northern Irish aspirations. We're very close. I'm very close to a party called the Traditional Unionist Voice in Northern Ireland, who are staunch believers in the sovereignty of this country. I don't know if you know TUV, led by a chap called Jim Allister, first class individual. And we will look to either cooperate with Jim, but if we can't find an arrangement with Jim, then I think it's incumbent on us to stand not just in Great Britain, but in Northern Ireland as well, and have a pan-European, pan-UK, forgive me, that was a really bad slip, a pan-UK force. How can we represent people properly in Westminster unless our own seats depend on the people that put us in Parliament? The reason the Tories don't give a damn about Northern Ireland and the Labour Party don't give a damn is because they don't have any seats coming from Northern Ireland. So I think mainstream politics needs to get involved with Northern Ireland.
So on the Northern Ireland topic, obviously we saw the riots in Ballymena in Northern Ireland, and that kind of has perhaps replicated some views in the UK. How would you deal with that sort of tension and that sort of outbreak of violence if you was a political leader in Britain or in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, so there's been a reluctance, a refusal, not a reluctance, a refusal by the British political class to recognize the legitimate fears of what I would call the white working classes of the United Kingdom. The white working classes, and many others, including people who aren't white, have been calling for immigration to be brought under control, calling for a social contract with the government which puts the British people first, calling for illegal migration to be stopped, and to stop this progressive discrimination in favor of people who come to this country, including people who've broken into this country illegally. And one of the reasons I think we had the violence after the Southport killings, for example, and we had the violence in Ballymena, and we've had all those protests in Epping and other places across the UK, is because the British political class, the establishment, is not protecting the people. The people need to feel the protective blanket of the state around their shoulders, and then they won't feel the need to protest in that way. Of course, there's no room for violent protests. There's no room for um, violence. That has to be stopped. But the best way to stop it is not through draconian policing, but by actually listening to the people and delivering for the people. It's interesting to me that I don't know if you were there, weren't you, at the
Yeah.
Unite the Kingdom rally the other day? We met, in fact, didn't we, Sophie? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And and well, you saw hundreds of thousands of people, if not a million, and there were 2.5 million people watching online. And within moments of that rally ending, Starmer described everyone there as far right. Now you might be able to find 10,000, 100,000, maybe a couple of 100,000 far right people in the UK. I think they'd be hard pushed to find a couple of 100,000, but you cannot describe 3.5 million people as far right, and that is Parliament, that's the establishment actually turning its back on the British people, flicking a V sign at the British people and saying, we don't want to do what you wish us to do. And that's also why I think, Sophie, we've had so much turmoil in British politics, because so many of the people who ostensibly represent us are actually turning their backs on us. And which is also why I'm coming full circle now, which is also why I want Advance UK to have a manifesto with the draft legislation so that when we get voted in, people know exactly what we're going to do and we have the people's support for it. And then we deliver knowing we've got the people behind us. And if you do that, no one can quibble. You won't fall out of favour because you've done what you promised you would.
I agree. And to be fair, you were the only politician that turned up to that rally. Your speech was absolutely fantastic, and you addressed that in your speech. But the one thing that potentially you don't have, that all of the other parties have the luxury of having, is the media by your side. How are you going
Yeah.
to overcome that? Obviously, speaking at those rallies is definitely a way to do it, because that is a lot of people. You're speaking to people like myself, but how are you going to plan to get into sort of regular households, especially if you're not starting to regularly campaign in these local elections in the upcoming years? What is your long-term plan to overcome that barrier?
So one of the things I did when we set up Advance UK was to a self-imposed hurdle of 30,000 members before we applied to the Electoral Commission to become a registered party. And one of the reasons I did that was to make sure that we actually had effectively a campaigning team right across the United Kingdom. You can fight a general election with 30,000 members. It's enough. That's what Reform had during the 2024 general election. So to get round the fact that mainstream media is effectively opposed to us, we will be using the grassroots network that we've already established to start campaigning. And we are already doing that, Sophie. We are already now going to be reaching out to our 30,000, 36,000 members. We're going to be making it possible for them to get Corex boards, to get leaflets, to get manuals in how to campaign locally, encouraging them to get more people to join. We're going to start the general election fight today. We're not going to wait for the general election to be called. We are on a war footing. I mean that in a metaphorical sense. We're on a war footing already. And something that is hot off the press, which I can let you know ahead of it becoming more generally known, is that I'm going to set the party a target of 1 million members. We need to get 1 million members into the party. Why? One, because I think it gives us an even bigger democratic mandate. If we have 1 million people in the party, we will hear their views. We will know precisely what it is that they want us to do in government. We will have a direct connection with the British people. We've got to get to as close to 1 million as possible. And the other reason I want it is for the campaigning. Can you imagine what a force that would be if we had 1 million people in the party campaigning for us in 2029? And the difference between people who join Advance and people who join the Tories or join Labour, is that anyone joining Advance is utterly committed to the purpose for which we have created ourselves. They're utterly committed to saving the UK. They're much more energized, much more driven than the average member of the Tory party or Labour Party. And if we can get to 1 million people, we won't need mainstream media. We won't need anything. We will just take the country by storm. And so we're going to use the 36,000 nucleus, which, by the way, we got to 36,000 in record time in 2 months, with the mainstream media effectively having cancelled me. And we still did it. The people know who we are. We're going to get to them, and we're going to be a force with which the political fabric is going to have to reckon. They're not going to like it. They're all going to resist it because we're new and we're bringing new people in and we've got new ideas and we're going to stand against the establishment. No one's going to like it.
I think one of the interesting things I've always found about political party membership, and obviously I was a Conservative for a long time, is that things like party conference, you know, I'm a normal person from Thurrock in Essex, I'm not exactly rich. It would be like almost like the cost of an entire holiday just to go to party conference. And a lot of these parties have, obviously they must do because they've got such a need for fundraising, but that ends up sort of pushing out the sort of working class normal people from really being involved in the party. Because I mean, you know, what person can really afford to spend £500 on a 3-day political party conference that's a normal person? They can't really do it. So
Yeah.
how are you planning on making Advance a little bit more of an accessible party for people of ordinary backgrounds, most of whom would probably vote for you?
So we've got a category that membership costs, well, it had cost £10 until today. Today's the last day to join, just paying £10 for your annual membership. So anyone listening who wants to join Advance and hasn't joined yet, please join today because you get in for 10 quid. Tomorrow it'll be £20, which is still a much lower fee, annual fee than the other parties. I think the Tories are at £36 a year or something like that. Reform is for its adult membership. I think it's at £25 per annum. I think I'm going by memory. But also, we have a category of what we call supporters. So if you are unable to join, unable to afford the £10 or £20 from tomorrow, that is the cost of membership, you can just join as a supporter. And you're connected to the party. You'll get emails from the party, and you can engage with the party in campaign and help the party, you know, win the next general election. But the other reason to try to get to 1 million members, if we can, is at 1 million members at £20 a year, where we'll have £2 million a year. That will give us the fighting fund we need to actually mount the general election. We'll have 8 million quid. Well, let's say we get 6 or 7 million quid because it takes time to get up to that million membership. That is a general election fund, and we will use our money much more judiciously than the main parties will. We'll get a much bigger bang for our buck. So we're not going to waste money on snazzy conferences in massive arenas with lots of fireworks and loud music and choreography. We're going to be very serious, I'm afraid, just bang out our message, make sure people understand what it is we stand for, and then hopefully carry the people with us.
So obviously moving on from our local elections and our mayorals, we've got another two sets of elections this year, being the Welsh Parliament and the Scottish Parliament elections. Are you going for those elections? I know you've been really, really active in Wales. What's your plan? Are you going to stand candidates there, or is it all just up to 2029?
Oh, no, I mean, we will, particularly in Wales, we'll see what it looks like for us in February, March next year when we're thinking a decision would need to be made. What we don't want to do is waste a lot of energy fighting an election when we haven't got enough traction as a party to win an election. You know, so we will just be looking at the landscape. We've obviously also got to get our electoral registration in place. Some people say that could take 6 months. I don't know. I can't see why it shouldn't take more than a few days. But let's see how that plays out. And uh, but we're just going to it's going to be, as I said, an opportunistic approach to local and devolved authority mayoral elections. Just see what the landscape is like, which candidates we've got, whether or not we've already got councillors and so on in that region. And if we've got support, if it looks like we could win seats, yeah, then absolutely we'd have a go. But it'll be an opportunistic approach. All eyes on 2029.
Do you know where your support is at the moment? Because, for example, Reform, they obviously would, when they had no MPs, would target the seaside towns as they had much more significant chance of winning it. Do you know sort of any idea now what your target seats could be at this point in time, or are you just not sure yet?
Yeah, so broadly, what was good for Reform as a target seat will be good for Advance UK. Um, Reform has moved its political colours since I was a member of Reform. Reform has moved decidedly what it describes itself to be to the left side of politics. Um, you know, taking on people like Nadine Dorries, Jake Berry, Andrea Jenkins, they're turning into a kind of one nation Tory party with Farage leading it as opposed to a Tory leading it. So I think they're going to find that the kinds of seats that were good for them in 2024 aren't going to be so good for them in 2029 because they're going to be quite a different kind of party. And I know precisely which seats were good for Reform in 2024. We've got the empirical evidence. We've got all the election results. So we know exactly where we need to target.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were some seats that Reform could have done better in historically that perhaps they didn't do as well as in 2024. One of them being my seat in Thurrock in Essex. I mean, that was a real UKIP sort of pro-Brexit hotbed, and they didn't perhaps perform as well as I expected them to do. So that being said,
Reform was very thin on the ground in 2024. The election came early. We weren't ready for it. And we just had to get stuff done. And James McMurdoch, I think, won his seat from not far from where you are. And, he was just a paper candidate, which just tells you the nation is crying out for change. And we will be that change. I don't want to talk about reform. I think we said before we got on this, we don't want to talk about reform. But reform isn't what people think it is. It's not what they voted for. They carry the hopes and aspirations of the British people, but it's actually Advance UK that will deliver.
So we're going to switch quickly to a Labour conference now as it's going on. I'm sure you've been keeping up with it. One of their key policies at the moment has been to basically bring in what they call a youth experience scheme, which is essentially an EU youth mobility scheme. So we're seeing them roll back quite strongly on Brexit. What is your thoughts on what they're doing in this regard? I know you've spoken about it before.
Well, people often say Brexit hasn't worked. Brexit hasn't worked. You can't actually say that because we never really left the European Union. What we've now got is a slightly different hue of membership, but we are still hitched at the hip to the EU. And Northern Ireland famously has been left behind in the EU, which creates all sorts of problems for the United Kingdom more generally, because there's the long arm of EU regulation and law coming through Northern Ireland into Great Britain. So we never left. And one of the reasons the UK has been unable to chart an optimistic pro-British economic, constitution and legislative path is because it's hampered by all these EU regulations and laws to which we are still subject. And what Starmer is doing is using the closeness that we still have to the EU to take us even further back into the European Union, which, as we all know, is a fundamentally anti-nation state, progressive discrimination, socialist model. And it is the antithesis of what the British people want. The British people want the United Kingdom to be proud sovereign and making policies for itself, for its people, and eschewing the international order. That's what we voted for in 2016. Starmer is taking us into the EU. He's doing it with sanitary and phytosanitary regulations so that all our agri-goods are going to have to comply with EU laws. The entire United Kingdom is going to have to dance to the march to the drumbeat of the EU. He's making us subject to their carbon taxation systems. So we'll actually be paying tax into EU coffers, depending on the carbon component of products that are coming into the United Kingdom. That is absolutely the opposite of our national interest. He's even taking our military into the European Defence Union, which I think is the worst possible thing he could do. effectively handing over control. This is what's going to happen: the handing over control of British military to Brussels. That is the end of your ability to defend yourself as a country. We will have what they call interoperability with the European Union. Our armed forces won't be able to operate independently of EU armed forces. They could shut us down at the flick of a switch. That's where it's going. So all of that will be rejected by Advance UK. The policies we're going to adopt are going to yank the United Kingdom firmly out of the European Union so that we can bring into place policies that are good for this country, that put this country forward. And we're going to have a very upset European Union. The EU is going to hate Advance UK. And we're also going to have to be prepared for that. We're going to have to make regulations, or deregulate rather, and lower taxes in a way that will supercharge the British economy so that we can take on the European Union. We're going to be we're going to go back, Sophie, to being a proud, nimble, self-confident, assertive Ireland again. And we're going to tell the EU and these other supranational institutions that have been dragging us down to sod it.
So,
It's early in the morning, so I won't use the language that came into my head. Yeah.
if Advance was to go into government, obviously you touched on there, a lot of the sort of prime ministers and leaders that we had in the past, they love their Davos dinner parties. They love being
Yeah.
in that sort of international community. Are you going to make any international friends, Ben?
We are going to have lots of international friends, but I'm not going to hobnob and plead with them and be obsequious and be up their backsides. I'm not going to brown nose on the international stage, which is what they all do at Davos. They all get into bed with big money, make plans, dream up silly ideas on a global basis that they think are great for the world at large, and forget about the fact that they represent the British people. They represent this island. And what is good for us is not going to necessarily be good for Germany or Italy or the United States or Australia. We should be friends with them. Of course, we should be friends with them. No one wants a bust up for the sake of a bust up, but they need to recognize that our friendship comes with British national interests in mind. And that's always going to be first and foremost. So we will try and find accommodations with our international friends in a way that doesn't compromise our own aims. That's got to be critical. Every other country does it successfully, with the exception of the European Union and the UK. Every other country establishes its international relationships based on what's in its best interest. You look at China. China doesn't do anything on the international stage which doesn't benefit China. We've got to be the same.
Have you been sort of conversing with any sorts of more right-wing parties, you know, maybe the likes of the AfD, in any of the countries at all? Have you been building those sorts of relationships at the moment?
That we've So Jim Ferguson, who's a member of our college, is spearheading that effort, and he's got good links across Europe in the various parties that are similar, have a similar political philosophy to us, and in the United States. And obviously, Elon Musk, as you know, has endorsed Advance UK, and I think we've got a good ally in the US, and we will be developing those links as we go forward. Particularly the American one's very important for us because come 2029, when we do the kinds of things we're going to do, Sophie, we are going to get a lot of international pushback, and we will need the support of a strong America behind us. So I hope that we get a Vance presidency after Trump, or another Republican presidency of the same, MAGA kind of approach to life, because the MAGA approach to life recognizes the importance for them. I'm going to say mega. I don't mean England. I mean all of the United Kingdom. Muga. MAGA recognizes the need for a Muga. We must make the United Kingdom great again. It's good for the US if we're doing well. It's good for the world, actually, if the United Kingdom does well. And that's why I think so many of our American friends look at the UK and are so disappointed, because we were a rock. We were a rock of stability in the world. We never did anything stupid. We were always the people on whom the world could rely to have thought things through and done things in a measured way. And that's been set aside in the last 10, 15 years. And we've got to go back to being that wonderful country that we were.
Yeah, so on that, I think, Keir Starmer has definitely damaged our reputation globally. My mum's boss is from the US, and one of the things he always says when he comes over here is, "Oh my God, what if I'm going to get arrested for my tweets?" So it's not just us
Yeah.
here in the UK. I mean, that sort of perception of the UK becoming extremely authoritarian. Obviously, we've betrayed some of our closest allies in recognising Palestine as a state, and we're no longer trusted to be told things. How would you restore Britain's reputation globally?
Well, the most important thing is to re-engineer the constitutional fabric of the United Kingdom. The constitutional fabric of this country has been hijacked from Blair onwards, and we've entered into treaties and we've adopted legislation, which we put in place legislation which has hollowed out what it means to be a British citizen, what it means to put the United Kingdom first. In fact, we've put in place policies which put the United Kingdom repeatedly second. The Equalities Act, for example, which requires us to progressively discriminate in favor of people with protected characteristics, which basically means you've got to discriminate against British people. Now, you cannot be a democratic country if you're discriminating against the majority of the people in your country. That is the antithesis of democracy, which is why I say that we've got the establishment giving a V sign to the British people. They're putting ethnic minorities' interests ahead of ours, ethnic minority religious beliefs ahead of our Christian constitution and our Christian culture. They are putting transgender ideology on a pedestal and setting aside the rights of women, which took a century to fight for and establish, and using the same liberal arguments that emancipated women and put them on an equal footing with men. They are now using that same liberalism to set aside women. All of this needs to be reversed. And none of it is sexy work, but it's all critical work to actually re engineer our constitutional framework so that we can. And that, by the way, Sophie, will settle us immediately because it'll require institutions, businesses, government to immediately do the right thing. Once we reconnect with our purpose is as government, what our purpose is in the armed forces, what our purpose is in the police, which is not to be policing tweets and making sure that minorities are not being insulted. Their job is to make sure that doors aren't being bashed down and thievery isn't taking place and violent crime is brought under control and so on and so forth. And so we've got to reconnect with what it is that we're meant to be doing as a government and the various institutions in this country. And that's going to be the primary job, which is why we need this legislation in place at day one. I mentioned the manifesto would have all the draft legislation. That's why it's critical, because we need to be able to go into Parliament on day one, slap down that legislation and say, right, by tomorrow, this is in place. We're burning down all this crap that has hijacked the country for the last 30 years. And that will settle the nation. That will in itself settle the nation.
So we've talked about resistance from international leaders, but there's no doubt that the biggest resistance to the change that you are wanting to implement is going to come from public sector workers, the civil service. How are you going to get the public sector on side? How are you going to deal with the resistance from the civil service who potentially will look to sabotage whatever you want to bring in?
Yeah, so they can try and sabotage whatever they like. We will make sure. Well, there are two forms of resistance, I think, three forms of resistance. The House of Lords, and we're going to address them by making sure we've got the draft legislation. The civil service, and the way we're going to address them is reveal to them we've got the democratic mandate. The Lords is passing it, but also it comes back to your initial point. We've got to have people capable of managing the civil service, and we've got to have people who've run organizations before and are prepared and able to stand up to, because we all face this in our own lives when we run organizations. you have middle management who push back, try and usurp authority, you've got to be able to say, right, I'm going to sack you, get out of the way. And even if that creates a void, even if that creates a problem, you have the confidence and ability to deal with that problem so that your greater aim and your purpose is not defeated. And so I will just sack people. We will sack people. The civil service is way too big. And if they think they're beyond reproach, they better think again, because it's just an act of parliament that's required to do whatever we need to do to deal with the civil service. This notion, and it comes back, I think, to the Tory party and the Labour Party not really having any capable people in it. You look at the complexion of the front bench, and they're pretty damn useless, as I'm afraid of most of the shadow cabinet. None of them have really had any experience in real life. They've never done anything. They've never dealt with problems. They've never dealt with problems which are um, of a existential nature. You know, those of us, I've run a small business for most of my life. When you run a small business, you're permanently facing the end of your business. Not permanently, but, you know, often you have threats which could be the end of your business. And you've got to have the ability to take that threat, analyze it, understand what needs to be done, have the ability to do that, and have the fortitude to stay the distance. And that's what we're going to have to do with the civil service. The third body of people who are going to stand against us are all these quangos and, you know, the OBR, the Ofcom, Elcom. All of these people are going to try and take us down, and we're going to have to deal with them at day one too.
So one of the things you spoke about before was about positive discrimination. I'm running a anti-positive discrimination campaign in order to try and get rid of that part of the Equality Act that basically means that white young people are not getting jobs, the BME ones, and that is a real big problem for young people. What are your policies towards young people? How are you going to get young people to attract to Advance UK? Because I feel like sometimes the right sort of feel like they are never going to get young people on side, so they just don't try, and that's why they never get young people on side. Are you going to try and attract young people?
Well, so much of what I've said already is so positive for the young in this country. You know, if you were to slash migration, if you were to deregulate, two things would happen. The demand for housing would reduce. And because you deregulate, you'd be able to build many more houses and repurpose houses much faster than you can now. This government's talking about building 1.5 million houses. And I've looked at the changes that they've made to the planning legislation, and they have tried to deregulate the ability to build on green fields, but they're still hamstrung by net zero targets. So they can't repurpose thousands of existing buildings which are now derelict and giving rise to criminality and you know, the dereliction of our town centres and so on. They can't be repurposed because net zero puts them beyond use. And yet we're going into our green fields, building really expensive housing because of the net zero requirements, and then handing it over to migrants who've come to this country or foreigners who are on benefits and so on. But if you remove the demand for housing, you deregulate the process of making housing and the requirements for it. You can then repurpose housing. You create much more supply. You remove the demand. Hey presto, young people can afford to get back on the ladder again. They can. Are you with me? And
Yeah.
if you remove the mass migration that we've had, if you effectively empower British workers, wages will go up. And if you reduce taxes on the working and middle classes, the wages that have gone up in value, more of that will come into people's back pockets. So young people leaving university, school or university will be able to get on the housing ladder. They'll have a much higher income than they can at the moment, and they'll pay less tax on that income. Now, that is that's a phenomenal contract with the young people. What I tore my hair out in the 2024 general election. Because when I was at Reform, I was saying, look, you've got to put one page in the manifesto which brings together the various policies we've outlined that would be good for young people. There's so much that Advance will do that's good for young people. We just need to show the young people how that would work, and we will be doing that.
Great. Another thing that I was going to ask you was, again, what is your approach to net zero and the sort of backlash that you're going to get from the international community from that? Because you're very outspoken on this.
Yeah. So as I said, we're going to have to be prepared for an onslaught from the international community. And the way to deal with that onslaught is to deregulate. And a key component of it, which is going to irritate them, but it's also the way we're going to prevail, is to ditch net zero. And the ditching of net zero doesn't just mean drill, baby, drill, which it does, which is great. And we should be taking gas from the North Sea. We should be taking whatever oil we can from the North Sea. But ditching net zero also means you can keep your depreciated cars that cost £2,000 or £3,000 to buy and are actually performing extremely well. And you won't have to pay £12.50 to £12.50 just when you take it out of your drive in Greater London. You won't have to replace it with an electric car at vast cost, which, by the way, is not that carbon emission. It's not that much better on carbon emissions, than modern cars are anyway. You won't have to exchange your perfectly good gas boiler for a heat exchanger. You won't have to insulate your house to the nth degree, making it more and more expensive to live in it. Drafts in a house are actually quite a good thing. They keep the house aired. I don't know if you've ever been into these hermetically sealed new houses they build nowadays, but they're really uncomfortable. There's not a feeling of any air in the property. So we're going to do all of that, and that is going to irritate the international community. But it's going to bring the cost of living in the United Kingdom dramatically downwards. It's going to allow the repurposing of properties dramatically, which will supercharge our businesses. And then on top of that, which is where I started, it'll be drill, baby, drill. So we'll have much cheaper energy. What could be better for the British economy, for the youth, the middle-aged, and the elderly than cheap energy? It's going to work. It is going to work. It's self-evidently going to work.
Do you think Britain is ready for such radical change, though, considering we've gone through literally my entire life of what I would say is managed decline? Because we saw when Liz Truss became Prime Minister that she tried to enact some quite radical economic changes that would get Britain growing again. And, well, it didn't end very well, did it? So do you think this country is ready for radical change?
So this country will go down. It'll go down the plug hole if we don't have radical change. We're either on the precipice or over the precipice and need to be lassoed and brought to safety. But we are practicing policies and governing ourselves in a way that is not managed decline. This is just free fall. It is absolutely absurd the way the country is being governed at the moment. Liz Truss didn't have a democratic mandate, and I think that was part of the problem. But if we have stood up for the policies that we're going to stand up for, and the British people have voted us in, and we've got these acts of parliament already drafted, ready to go, it's going to happen. And the international community is just going to have to lump it. And the British people will feel the burden lifted off their shoulders at day one. There won't be one day Advance UK won't be in government. The next day it'll be in, and we would have changed everything. You'll wake up, everything will feel the same. But over the weeks and months ahead, and the years ahead, you will just be liberated. You will feel more and more liberation. And you'll actually feel that liberation instantly because you will know what we'll be doing. I don't know if you were like this, Sophie. This isn't quite on the United Kingdom, but when Trump won the election in the US, I was watching it, into the early hours. And I went to bed almost pinching myself, thinking, they're going to try and reverse this. Something's going to go wrong. It's too good to be true that he's won. And then I was driving into the office later on that morning when I'd gathered myself a bit and had time to reflect on it. And I literally felt like a weight had come off my shoulders, like there was hope that Western civilization could now be rescued because we would stop practicing these policies which are going to kill Western civilization if we don't stop it. So yes, they're going to be dramatic, but they are utterly necessary. We need to do it. If we care about this country, if we love this country, if we want our children to inherit from us this country as a country, we've got to do what Advance UK is going to offer.
Well, talking about children, obviously one of the most existential threats that we have now in the UK is that people are not having them. So how would you encourage more young white British families to have children? Because I can absolutely tell you it is not about mindset. It is about the fact that we don't have stable housing, jobs, and we simply can't afford them.
Yeah, so you've just hit the nail on the head. And you would have heard me say earlier in this interview how we will create jobs, how we'll create housing, how we're going to allow the economic organism of the United Kingdom actually to flourish. And that's a critical component of having families. It's also a critical component of health. If people are wealthy, better off, they look after themselves better, they feel better, they don't have the burden of stress on them. So we will be a healthy, wealthy nation. And with that health and wealth will come an inclination anyway to procreate and to have families. Because when you feel secure, you don't want to people don't want to bring children into an insecure world. They want to do it when they feel secure, when they know they can look after their children. So everything we do will encourage procreation. But we are going to have a bonk for Britain policy. And the bonk for Britain policy is going to be a reward to people through the tax system for getting married, a reward through the taxation for every child they have, not benefits, but a reward through the taxation system. So if they work, if one of the spouses is working, they'll get a tax break for every child that they have, and a reward, a tax break for one spouse if the other spouse is staying at home and looking after the children. So instead of the cost of having to get the state to look after your children because both parents are working, and effectively then handing over control of your child to the state. And we know what the state does with children in their care, indoctrinates them with all the nonsense that you and I have just discussed. We want to bring back the incentive to have families, both through a healthy, wealthy nation, but also through specific policies, which I'm going to call Bonk for Britain, so everyone gets it.